Welcome to our next episode of Fun with Procurement. We're putting the cool back into procurement as if it ever left. I'm your host, Emma Edwards, and I'm with the marketing team at 2x2. This episode is sponsored by our friends over at Freedom Media, who are making the podcast possible today. We're joined again today by Rob Kisek, CEO of 2x2, and Nathan Swinney, Head of Category at 2x2. This episode's topic is why being poor at contract management can cost you. At the end of the episode, we'll know the pitfalls of managing contracts and how to make your contract work for you. Hello, Rob, Nathan. We're going to start with an important question again. What do you wish you'd known 10 years ago?
I'll go first if that's all right, Nathan.
Sorry, Rob.
No, that's fine. I think in terms of things I wish I'd known 10 years ago, I think knowledge-wise, I've probably learned an awful lot over the last 10 years. 10 years ago, 2x2 was about 18 months old. And in that time, we've gone from about 4 of us to over 60 staff. So it's been a heck of a learning curve. There's probably a lot of stuff I'd like, but I think actually one of the things that makes our team so good is the people. So I actually wish I'd known some of the people that I know now through working with them in 2x2. I wish I'd known them 10 years ago because that would have been a real bonus.
That's lovely.
That's a good answer.
And I wished I'd known you as well, Rob, 10 years ago. Clearly it includes me. I think for me, I wished I'd known the lottery numbers 10 years ago, if I'm honest. I think that would have made a great impact on my life. And I could have invested in 2x2, Rob, I think. And in all seriousness, I think to get more sleep. So I didn't realise 10 years ago that I'd have the number of kids that I do. And I could have done with a lot more sleep 10 years ago to prepare, I think.
You probably missed out on 10 years of sleep.
Yes.
Okay, let's dive into the topic of contract management then. Can you give us some examples that you've seen in your careers of poor contract management? And we'll start with Nathan this time.
Oh, I've seen some horrific examples of contract management. The worst ones, I have to say, and the ones that really, really bother me are the adversarial contract management. So what we've got to remember is that we deal with humans, people, and that contracts ultimately are relationships. Suppliers are people. And I've seen some horrific contract managers who have treated suppliers really badly, thumped the table, demanding better results and better outcomes and threats. At the end of the day, we're everybody's in the same boat. We're all trying to achieve the best we can for our families, and to earn a living. And I think adversarial contract management just is a lose-lose every single time. So I think that's one of the worst types of contract management I've seen, and basically just results in no relationship. The supplier will do the very minimum they can because basically they don't like you. And that's awful, isn't it? We don't want to come to work to not be liked. I've seen some poor contract management on the basis of what we call let and forget. So the hard work's been done. We've procured it. We've got a great supplier. We've got great prices, great terms, great quality. We've done a good job on our procurement, so we can forget about it now. And that is a really bad example of contract management. Even the best procurement. You could run the most perfect procurement process in the world. It will still need managing. It still needs monitoring. Suppliers, yes, need holding to account, but also you need to build that relationship. That's as much as important as possible in services contracts. So where you're working with a supplier who's perhaps an outsourced supplier or someone that's dealing with services or really importantly, who's representing your business or your organization to your customers, it's very important that you don't let and forget, that you do meet with your suppliers regularly. So the other type of bad contract management is what we call evergreen contracts. And this is where a supplier basically just keeps rolling over your contract. You've got no idea of where you stand in terms of the contract duration, what terms you're on, what prices you're meant to be paying, what you're actually meant to be delivering. And what can sometimes happen is there's a change of person within your organization. Say, someone that was managing a contract has moved on, retired, gone to another job, and basically that contract has been left or handed to someone who doesn't really own it or take responsibility. And what happens is, in those cases, the supplier will manage it. And the supplier will naturally manage it in a way that's going to suit them and their outcomes. So it's about finding that win-win balance. But yes, there's been some pretty terrible contract management examples out there, from adversarial to forgetting about it to being completely managed by a supplier and never having a handle on it.
Thanks, Nathan. I guess that's where supplier relationship management comes in as well, then, to keep the communication open. Rob, have you got any examples of poor contract management?
Yeah, far too many, unfortunately. I think I've seen some horrific clauses within contracts, and quite often it does come down to this kind of let and forget. Well, I've done it, and then over to whoever it is to receive the goods or get the service delivered. I think contract management, as Nathan says, is very much about relationships. Ultimately, procurement is about relationships, and the strength of that relationship, how you build those relationships, is absolutely critical. And I've seen clauses in contracts that have been put in where you have a contract and it says you bear the right to exit this contract if we don't give you a cost increase of 10% or 15% every year, i.e., if the supplier doesn't increase the cost, then you can leave. And it's so one-sided, and that comes really from right at the start, not engaging with the suppliers and understanding the suppliers, and understanding who you're getting into business with effectively when you're contracting. So poor contract management starts right at the start in understanding what it is you're trying to buy and understanding what the value is in the contract, both to yourselves and as the procurement person, as the person buying it, and also to the supplier. And I think the other side of contract management then, in terms of where it can fall down, is engaging your wider stakeholders. So procurement is a facilitating department. It's a department which brings other parts of the business together or an organisation together to be able to deliver something. And if you don't do that well and you don't engage your other stakeholders in a contract, then quite often you can find, you can think, well, this is being delivered, and it's being delivered at the price that they said it should have been delivered at, and it's been delivered on time. But actually, sometimes the need within the organisation has changed, and if you don't continually engage with the stakeholders within your organisation during the lifetime of a contract, then it can become quite easy for that contract to become less and less relevant, and then as a result of that, delivering less and less value to you as an organisation. So I think that's certainly key areas where I've seen poor contract management in the past.
Yeah, that's a great example, Rob. And some of the classic ones are around scope creep. So as you say, Rob, where things change. And as a result of that change, a supplier can go, well, yes, we can account for that change, but it's going to cost you, and this is where, if you have variation clauses in your contract, you can agree, certain variations and what the basis of that renegotiation of that price is, agreement disputes, whose terms win in certain circumstances. And again, that goes back to whose terms did you sign? Was it your terms, our terms as the buyer, or was it the supplier's terms? How reasonable are those terms? Another one is overcommitment. As the supplier overcommitted, have they stretched themselves? And, they may have been desperate to win the business and promised the earth, but actually it was undeliverable in terms of the price. So I think one of the things buyers often, as procurement people, often recognise is that we take responsibility not just for ourselves, but we have to take responsibility for our suppliers as well, to a degree, and make sure that they're not getting into contract situations which they can't handle, and that comes back to how well that procurement has been undertaken and how you've evaluated suppliers. But yes, Emma, there's been some really bad contract management examples, as we've said. And I'm sure some of the
Yeah.
listeners here might have some examples. And if you do, get in touch. We want to hear about those and how we can maybe help.
We'd love to
Yeah,
hear them.
we had an example from a few years back, and I think one of the challenges with contract management is you focus on one area of it. And back back in the day when I used to do procurement in emergency responses, we procured some blankets as an example, and as part of the procurement there was the procurement of the blankets, and part of the contract was the delivery of those goods into a country that needed them at the time. And they were producing these blankets, and as part of the process, we had an inspection process in place that was verifying the quality of the blankets to the right standard. So we had all the kind of things that were in place that we thought, well, we've got the contract management here, we're talking to the supplier, we've got the inspection there to ensure the quality, we've got the delivery, and we've arranged for that. But what happened was actually the first lot of blankets that were produced, the supplier produced the blankets, they went in for inspection, and between the inspection happening and the results of the inspection, the report coming to us, they shipped the blankets, and actually the blankets failed inspection. And we had a choice when we got them. We kind of looked at the inspection, and actually slightly kind of the stitching around the edge of the blankets effectively wasn't to standard, and they were starting to come undone. We think, well, how do we do this? You've got a choice. You can either go in and slam the supplier and say, well, this was completely unacceptable, we're not paying for this, But actually, the better approach, the approach that we took was to say, well, why are the blankets failing? What is wrong with the stitching? And it turned out the machines that they had were not good at doing 90-degree stitches. So we said, okay, well, let's do rounded corners on the blankets. And we ended up working with the supplier and actually changing the design of what they did. But I think it could have been really easy, pressures on, emergency, we've got to get these things. And you can become, it can be quite, you can quite naturally go to a kind of an adversarial place at times and think, you've just got to deliver this. But actually, we wanted to build a relationship with that supplier. So it's how do you kind of take that example of where it could have been, it was something that was going wrong, but then you work with the organization to try and make it right, I think, it does come back to relationships. And that can be for a one-off thing, or it could be something that you want to procure over a long period of time. But ultimately, it's always thinking about what's the end result, how do you get the best end result? And that's got to get involved engaging with that supplier.
Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. You've both mentioned some of the reasons for costs of poor contract management. What would you say the biggest costs of poor contract management are?
I think it's certainly time and resource. The amount of time that can be taken up, not just within the procurement, with the person doing the procurement, but within an organisation as a result of poor procurement. I think reputation, particularly, if I go back to the blankets example, there was a massive potential reputational risk there if those blankets that weren't to specification had suddenly gone out into the marketplace, into the end customer, the end user, the beneficiary in that context. But being able to stop that and being able to then work and revise and get that right meant reputationally that the reputation of the organisation I was working for was protected. But I think there is a big risk with poor contract management, reputational. That can be from poor quality. So if you're buying something that's poor, that's then going into a product you're producing, product failure has reputational issues. There's legal issues that come with that. So if you suddenly are producing a product and actually the quality of it drops off and you don't manage that well, then you can end up with legal challenges and legal issues as a result of that. So legal and reputational, I think, time are big areas where poor contract management can cost you as an organisation.
Yeah, one of the other big ones is the cost of rework, the cost of putting it right. And particularly if you've not been managing a contract well, and taking Rob's example of poor quality there, sometimes you don't realise until it's further down the line, and maybe it's one of your end users or customers or service users that is flagged that there is an issue with a service. By that point, it's probably been happening for a while, and the cost of putting that right, in terms of them bringing in the supplier, looking at what are the issues, and it's important to get the facts. That's one of the really important things in terms of when you do have an issue. Before you respond, before you react, before you sort of, as Rob rightly say, don't go down that adversarial route, but get the facts. What went wrong, what was the issue, talk to the supplier. But yeah, the cost of rework, and some of my previous examples have been in the construction world, where we've done contracts for quite large capital building projects. The cost of rework it can be extensive. If a contract hasn't been managed well, if it's been, if a contractor has been merrily carrying on based on a specification interpretation which isn't quite correct, sometimes the cost of putting that right can be extensive. And then you get into the wrangle of, well, who's responsible for that? Was it clear in the specification? Who takes ownership of that? Which then becomes, as Rob said, a legal matter sometimes. And then you get into relational difficulties. My word, the list can go on and on and on. And that's the last place you want to get to. So, yeah, the simple thing is manage the contract from the start. Understand what are the risks. And that's one of the key points here. With every procurement, you've got to set out from the start, what are the risks? What could go wrong? What are the big things that could fail? And have we addressed that in either the specification or the contract terms, or as part of the evaluation of suppliers? So, if it's an organisation that's providing you with grounds maintenance services, for example, there's risks around health and safety. Someone's going to be driving a tractor and a flail mower around a school field. So, there's going to be health and safety risks there. So where are those addressed? Because once it comes to the contract management side, it's often difficult to put right, because then it comes back to, well, actually the specification was wrong. Or you didn't tell us about that as part of the contract, and therefore we've not costed that in. So that cost of rework to put it right. And the worst case scenario there is the contract is cancelled or terminated because it's not working, and you've got to put then money, effort, time into re-procuring it and getting it right. And that is just horrendous. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the challenges with contract management sometimes is you can become so focused on the contract and not necessarily the context, both of the contract in which it's being delivered and also the kind of wider environment in terms of suppliers. So, as part of good contract management, you should be looking at, particularly for your more strategic products and services, looking at the suppliers that you're using. Are they overly reliant on you as a customer? Are they in a good financial position, a bad financial position? There's a lot of stuff going on over the last 15 months, 18 months within organizations where a lot of organizations that may have been generating huge profits are suddenly their whole business model has disappeared or changed over the last 18 months as a result of COVID. So there really is that constant evaluation and reevaluation of your suppliers. Are they still doing what you wanted them to do? Is what they're delivering for you core to them? But is it so core that actually if you pulled away, there'd be an issue with the resilience of the business? Or actually if they lost a different, are you 10% of their business, but another client is 80, 90% of their business? And then there's a resilience issue there. So there's poor contract management sometimes comes from factors which aren't directly related to your contract, but it may be the environment or the context within which you or the supplier is existing. And it's important to have that wider thought, I think, when you're looking at a contract management and say, where does this contract fit within us as an organization, within us as that supplies this from a supplier's perspective, and also within the kind of supply ecosystem, the supply system within that, which those products and services exist.
Brilliant. Thank you both. Yeah, and definitely due diligence is not a one-off task, and is something that should be constantly done, and the contract is in constant review. Definitely.
Absolutely.
What about if we go to the other end of the spectrum and there's no contract and things start to go wrong? What happens then? Nathan?
Well, I'd be surprised if there wasn't a contract. And the reason I say that is because when you think there isn't a contract, often it will be the supplier's contract. And you've possibly just overlooked that, or you've not realised that actually what you signed by way of a delivery note or by way of an award of a procurement is actually on suppliers' terms. Obviously, yes, that carries potential risk. We'd like to think that suppliers as organizations, as businesses are going to conduct themselves fairly in a contract relationship, that they're not going to impose onerous terms around some of the things Rob's mentioned around pricing and around termination clauses and variations. That's the hope, and we always hope for the better in these scenarios. But the fact that contracts exist entirely is on the basis that you've got to put in place something that assures the outcome of what you're spending your money on, and it's a value for money assurance that what you're getting is what you're paying for, and that you are protected if certain issues arise. So yeah, I would be surprised if there is no contract. The likelihood is that somewhere down the line, and we talked about evergreen contracts, those that have been, you may have had a supplier for 10, 15 years. You may have worked with that account manager and he's a lovely guy, and that's absolutely fine. But you may not realize that for that entire time there's been a point in time where some terms and conditions have landed on someone's desk, and to get it off the desk, someone has just gone, oh yeah, it's this supplier, we'll just sign it, great, off we go. We all do it. You get a new mobile contract, I accept these terms and conditions, scroll down, tick, that's it, done. And it's really important, particularly for key spends, large value, high risk spends, that you do take the time to understand what is the contract that's underpinning that. And if you're not sure, you need to be asking your supplier now. Because obviously part of those risks are things like, what happens if we want to exit? What happens if we think there's a better deal, or we're made aware of a better deal? What happens if there are issues with services and supplies and there's a problem? We want to address that. There's so many potential risks if there is no contract. So yeah, I would suggest you would need to find out as soon as possible.
Okay, thanks, Nathan. Rob?
Yeah, I think often one of the challenges particularly when new people come into an organisation, and I wouldn't say this is exclusively in smaller organisations, because I've definitely seen it in bigger organisations as well, where they don't know where the contract exists, or where the contract is. But I think there can quite often be a perception that, oh well, they just so and so delivers this, and he just turns up, and he knows to turn up on a Tuesday, or he knows to turn up on a Friday, or and quite often what you see is almost like kind of annual maintenance and renewal contracts, that kind of stuff. People will go, well, no, they don't. There's no contract in place. They just come every year and they do a renewal. They do the fire extinguisher tests, or they do whatever it might be, or the PAT tests, etc. And you go, well, okay, well, how often do they come? Well, they come every year. Okay, well, when was the last one? It was 8 months ago. All right, when are they coming next? Oh, they're coming next month. Hang on, that's 9 months, not 12 months. And then you start to ask, and you go, oh, hang on, actually, they're doing their 12-month inspection every 10 months, so they're getting an extra payment in over a 5-year agreement. And so it's important, I think, when you've got, sometimes it's that perception of a contract, or a perception of, it's kind of, I know what they do and they know what they do, so it's okay. The problem is then when that fire inspection doesn't get done, or it gets missed, or it doesn't get done properly, and then you look back and go, well, actually, I haven't, where is the agreement? And there isn't maybe something that's written down on paper. I do think that's rare, because as Nathan said, there's a classic thing called the Battle of the Forms, which is kind of a procurement thing where you basically, in negotiation, you're going back and forth, and you're giving your terms and conditions, and the supplier's giving their terms and conditions, and you basically battle it out to work out which ones win, and which ones apply. And usually, for if it's something significant, usually there's some degree of negotiation and discussion over them. But for that, when that happens, you've got that clarity. If that hasn't happened, then as Nathan said, they will be delivering those products, and when they deliver them, you'll be signing a delivery note for that, and in that delivery note signature, it'll say, you accept our terms and conditions. So there will, I would say 9 times out of 10, there is a contract, or there is a legal basis for a contract, whether that's written down or whether that's through implied through actions. But effectively, where you've got offer and acceptance of a product or service, there is a contract. There's a requirement to provide goods and to pay for them. So it's then about how do you unpick that, and how do you work out, well, what is the contract if you don't have a physical copy of it? And I would often say to kind of, particularly if we're talking to schools, charities, small businesses, if it's photocopying, for example, they've got a new school business managers come in, or a new person in the finance team, or procurement assistant, purchasing assistants come in. You say, well, where's the contract for photocopiers? Well, don't go to the supplier and say, I want to, can you please provide me the copy of the contract because I don't have one. Go to the photocopying company and say, we're thinking of leaving. Can you please tell me can you confirm what your understanding of the termination notice is, or something along those lines? And they will send you what they say it is, and you say, well, can you confirm to me in writing what that is, or provide me a copy of the contract that you've got, because I want to check it's the same as the one I've got. And then when they send that, then you've got a copy of what you hope is the latest version of the contract you can start to look at. So, I think there are ways you can, even when you don't have a copy of the contract, you can engage with the supplier, depending on who the supplier is and your level of relationship and trust, because that varies not just between products and services, but between suppliers. I think you can have that conversation with them in different ways to get that information, and then you can make a judgment. Does this contract work? Does it not work? If it doesn't work, how do I get out of it?
Thanks, Rob, for that. So, we've obviously discussed a lot about what can go wrong with contract management. So what can be done to reduce or stop contracts leaking value? And we'll go to Nathan.
Well, the first thing I think is really important is just getting visibility over what contracts are you in as an organisation. So we touched on this on one of the earlier podcasts, and it's a very simple step, but a really powerful and effective step, which is pulling together what we call a contracts register, which effectively is just a list of all the contracts. So who you spends with, what categories, the start date, end date, annual value, and that will give you a really good list, and as many of those categories as possible, as many of those contracts. And if you're unsure, then that's where you need to sort of look into that. And as Rob mentioned earlier, there's means and ways in which you can get that information from suppliers. But I think it's really important to understand who your contract's with to begin with. And then once you've mapped that out, it's a case of looking at how effectively are those contracts being managed. Whose terms are they on? When's the last time you met with those suppliers? And we've got to remember proportionality here. You can't be meeting with every single supplier every week. This is about understanding from your list of contracts which are the biggest spend areas, which are the high risk. If those contracts were to fail, what could have the potential to cause a major impact on your organisation, potentially shut it down. So I think it's about looking at what are the key risks for each of those contracts, and then assessing whose terms are you on, what are the risks, are those risks being covered, and when's the last time that you actually sat down and met with those suppliers. I would say that was a really big starting point, Emma.
Great, thanks, Nathan. Rob?
Yeah, I think supply management, how we engage with suppliers is definitely critical. I agree with Nathan there. I think where I see procurement sitting within most organisations, certainly as it starts to mature within an organisation, is procurement is kind of the glue between the contract supplier and the contract user, because procurement is very rarely the end customer in a contract. It's usually the enabler for an entity or a part of the organisation, the charity or the business or the school that you work, that's kind of using the product or service, and the supplier. So I think as well as engaging with the supplier side, it's really important to engage with your internal customers and your stakeholders internally, because I think there's a lot of quite often as a contract develops and it grows, particularly longer term contracts, the requirements and the needs of that internal stakeholder, that internal customer, can get lost or can change. And I think it's really important. Procurement can provide that kind of glue, that linking piece between the two, and almost slightly act as an independent. So if you've got Joe Bloggs supplier providing a product or service into your organization. Often the kind of adversarial relationships that can will develop between your internal customer, the one that's using the product or service, and the supplier. And procurement can kind of feel like a kind of mediator in the middle, working and helping them both to understand each other a bit better. And that's where I think emotional intelligence in procurement has really become an area that's developed. And a good procurement person needs to have that good emotional intelligence. They need to be able to read both your internal stakeholders and your suppliers. So I think in terms of reducing and stopping contracts leaking value, continual engagement with your internal customer, your internal stakeholder, what's working, what's not working, why is it working, why is that working better now than it was, can we do more of that, can we work with a supplier to enable them to do more of that, how can the supplier add value to your internal customers process or product that they're trying to produce. And really just acting as that kind of liaison between the two, I think is really important. There is undoubtedly, as contracts unfold, there is more value to be had. And so again, that kind of, Nathan touched on it earlier, I think the kind of let and forget is a terrible way of managing a contract, because you're effectively leaving value, you're leaving opportunity on the table that you could continue to get out of that contract. That's for the benefit of both. That might increase the cost of the overall contract, which is beneficial to the supplier. But actually, if that's giving you more value for your organisation, whether it's a charity or a school or a business, whoever that might be, then it's definitely worth that ongoing engagement.
Yeah, there's some really practical things as well, and contract management is proactive. It's a proactive activity. The minute it becomes reactive, you've got a problem where it's predominantly reactive. There's always going to be things that you need to react to. That's not to say reactive is a problem, but ideally what you want is to shift the balance from reactive to proactive. And being proactive is things like making sure that you've got a key performance schedule within your contracts that clearly lays out what you're expecting to be delivered, that is monitored and managed with the supplier, that you meet with that supplier. And I'm talking, important contracts, high value, high risk contracts, strategic contracts, particularly where you should be meeting with those suppliers, possibly monthly, bi-monthly, quarterly, whatever seems appropriate. But the format of that meeting then should detail then how is that contract performing? How is that supplier performing in relation to that KPI schedule? It's about understanding the terms, and we've talked about whose terms are those on. It's about monitoring the payments. It's about ensuring that the invoices match to what you actually should be charged. There's a number of practical things, but it's about being proactive with that and ensuring that you give due time. But like we said, the important thing is not trying to do that for everything, but certainly ensuring that it's covered for the most strategically critical contracts. And the starting point there is understanding, from an internal stakeholder perspective, what is deemed important. And in terms of the contracts register, as we've discussed, on paper, which is important as well.
Brilliant. Thank you both. That was a very interesting insight into contract management and some very useful advice, I would say. It is a vast topic and for many organisations, a full-time task, but getting it right obviously brings value and efficiencies. We have prepared some invaluable free resources for you and some great webinars coming up. You can find the links in the 2by2.com podcast webpage. You'll also find out where you can connect with our wonderful speakers today. We hope you enjoyed this podcast and found it useful. Don't miss our next episode on how to spice up your specifications. That's not one to be missed. Please leave us a review. Thanks for listening. I've been your host, Emma Edwards. See you next time. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.